The sun was setting as James Carter cruised through the upscale neighborhood in his sleek black car, his mind wandering as the city lights began to flicker on. Dressed in a simple hoodie and jeans, James looked no different than any other man winding down after a long day. What no one could tell by looking at him, though, was that he had just wrapped up another successful undercover operation for the FBI. James, in his late 30s, had become accustomed to blending in, something he excelled at. His job required him to move seamlessly through different environments, to be invisible when needed, and to stand out only when the mission called for it. But as he passed through the affluent streets of a predominantly white neighborhood, he noticed something all too familiar, a police cruiser tailing him closely. He sighed, glancing in his rearview mirror as the blue and red lights began to flash behind him. Instinctively, he pulled over to the side of the road, calm but annoyed. This wasn't the first time, and it wouldn't be the last. As he waited, James reached for his phone, ready to record the encounter, just in case. In today's world, being prepared was a necessity. The door of the police cruiser opened, and out stepped Officer Matt Blake, a young, clean-cut cop with a reputation in the area. Matt had been on the force for 5 years, but already he'd earned a name for himself for all the wrong reasons: harassing minorities, overstepping boundaries, and acting out of ego rather than duty. Tonight, he was about to take things too far. Matt approached the car, his hand resting on his holster, his expression already suspicious. He leaned down to the window as James rolled it down calmly. "License and registration," Matt barked, not bothering with a polite introduction. "Sure, officer. May I ask why I was pulled over?" James responded, keeping his voice neutral. Matt glared at him. "Suspicious activity in the area where you obviously don't belong," he said. James raised an eyebrow, but said nothing as he handed over his license and registration. He knew how to play the game. Don't resist, don't antagonize, just comply. But tonight, something felt different. The air was charged, and James could sense that this wasn't going to be just another routine stop. As Matt scanned James' license, his face hardened. He handed it back without a word. "Step out of the car," he ordered abruptly. James hesitated for a moment. There was no reason for him to step out of the car. He knew his rights. He'd done nothing wrong, and this officer had no valid reason to escalate the situation. But he also knew how quickly things could spiral out of control in moments like this. "Officer, is there a specific reason you need me to step out of the car?" James asked, his tone measured, still trying to keep the peace. Matt's patience snapped. "I don't need a reason. Step out of the car now," he howled. James felt the tension rising, but he complied, slowly opening the door and stepping out onto the pavement. Matt immediately grabbed him, roughly pushing him against the side of the car, forcing James' arms behind his back. "You're under arrest," Matt snarled, pulling out his handcuffs. "For what?" James asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "You're resisting," Matt said while struggling with the cuffs. The cuffs finally clicked around James' wrists, the cold metal biting into his skin. He stood there, pressed against the car, feeling the eyes of bystanders on him. A few had stopped to watch, some even pulled out their phones, recording the interaction. He couldn't help but feel the humiliation wash over him, but he kept his composure. Years of experience had taught him that losing his cool wouldn't help. As he stood there, another police car arrived on the scene. 2 additional officers stepped out, their faces blank but wary. They stayed back, watching, letting Matt take the lead. James' thoughts raced. He could reveal his identity right now. One word, and all of this would be over. But at what cost? His entire career, the case he had just spent months working on, would be compromised. He couldn't risk it, not yet. Matt searched James' car, rifling through the glove compartment, under the seats, and in the trunk, but found nothing. His frustration was palpable. To him, James' calmness was a sign of guilt, not innocence. "What are you looking for?" James asked, breaking the silence. "Drugs, weapons, anything illegal," Matt snapped. "You won't find any," James replied quietly. Matt shot him a glare, but before he could respond, one of the bystanders shouted, "Hey, why are you harassing him? He didn't do anything." Matt turned to face the crowd, his face contorted with anger. "Stay back," he barked. "This is police business." James could feel the situation spiraling. The crowd was growing, tensions rising. He had to do something before things got worse. "I'd like to call my lawyer," James said, his voice steady. Matt smirked. "Yeah, sure. After we get to the station," he said. At the station, James was led to a small interrogation room, the cuffs still tight around his wrists. The room was dimly lit, with a single table and 2 chairs. He sat down, the cuffs finally removed, and waited. He'd been in rooms like this before, but never on this side of the table. After what felt like an eternity, Matt walked in, accompanied by Sergeant Rick Daniels, a grizzled veteran of the force. Rick had seen it all, and while he wasn't known for being overly lenient, he was at least fair. Tonight, though, he looked tired, as if he'd already had enough of the day's drama. Matt sat across from James, while Rick leaned against the wall, arms crossed, watching. "All right, let's get this over with," Matt said, pulling out a file. "You've been arrested for resisting arrest and suspicion of drug possession." James' eyes widened. "Drug possession? You didn't find anything?" Matt smirked. "We'll see about that. Maybe we just didn't look hard enough." Rick cut in, his voice gravelly. "Look, I don't know what happened out there, but we're going to go through this by the book. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you." James leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. This was worse than he had expected. He could play along for only so long before things got out of hand. He needed to make a call, and he needed to make it soon. "I want my lawyer," James said firmly. Hours passed, and James sat alone in the interrogation room. His mind raced, calculating his next move. His decision to stay silent had allowed the situation to escalate, but revealing his identity too soon could have jeopardized ongoing investigations. Suddenly, the door creaked open, and a stern-looking man in a sharp suit walked in. Agent Chris Davison, the FBI field supervisor, was not pleased. He glanced at James, his jaw clenched in a subtle mix of anger and concern. James could see the weight of the situation reflected in his eyes. "James Carter?" Chris asked, making his voice loud enough for the room's camera to pick up. "Yeah," James replied with an exhale, his professional demeanor intact. Chris leaned forward. "You all right?" he asked. James gave a curt nod, appreciating the arrival of his superior, though it had taken longer than he'd expected. Behind Chris, Sergeant Daniels walked in, his earlier casual stance now stiff, his eyes flicking between the 2 men. His experience told him something was off. Matt followed closely, still smug, but Daniels could sense tension. The air had shifted, and the entry of this new man was the tipping point. Matt sat down. "So, who's this?" "Your lawyer," he asked with a mockery tone. Chris turned to face him, his face impassive. "I'm not his lawyer," he replied coldly. "I'm Agent Davison with the FBI." For a moment, silence hung thick in the air, the room shrinking as the weight of those words sank in. Matt blinked in confusion, and then he forced out a disbelieving laugh. "FBI? Him? You've got to be kidding me." Sergeant Daniels, however, wasn't laughing. His body language changed entirely. He knew they had crossed a line, and now there would be consequences. Chris handed him a card, and Daniels took it, reading the credentials carefully. His face grew stern. "Is this for real?" Daniels asked, his voice low, as if trying to confirm without causing a scene. Chris nodded. "Oh, it's real. James Carter here has been with us for over a decade. He's one of our best undercover agents." Matt's face went pale. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. His mind raced as he replayed the night's events. He'd profiled, assumed, and escalated all because of race, all without reason. The truth hit him like a ton of bricks. James leaned back in his chair, watching it unfold. The satisfaction of the reveal wasn't sweet, it was sobering. This was the reality he and others like him lived daily. His badge had shielded him for years, but tonight he had felt what so many others felt, powerless in the face of injustice. Matt's world began to spin out of control. Sergeant Daniels didn't mince words. He was furious, but in a controlled, professional way, which somehow made it worse. "Officer Blake," Daniels began, his voice low and cold, "do you realize what you've done?" Matt couldn't respond. His chest tightened, and sweat began to bead on his forehead. He had harassed and illegally detained an undercover FBI agent, and not just any agent, but one highly respected in the Bureau. The weight of that mistake was crushing. Daniels turned to Chris, the apology already forming on his lips. "Agent Davison, on behalf of the department." Chris raised his hand to cut him off. "This isn't just about an apology, Sergeant. We're looking at civil rights violations. Your officer didn't follow procedure. He escalated based on assumptions and racial profiling, and now, I have a good mind to escalate this up the chain." James remained silent, watching Matt squirm. It wasn't about vengeance, it never was, but it was about accountability. Too many like him had been falsely accused, harassed, or worse, without anyone ever facing consequences. "Officer Blake," Daniels said, turning his full attention to Matt, "you're suspended immediately. Turn in your badge and weapon." Matt stood frozen, his mouth hanging open. "Yes, sir, I was just..." "Now," Daniels barked, his tone sharp enough to cut through the tension. Matt fumbled, unhooking his badge and weapon, and placed them both on the table, the weight of his actions finally sinking in. Chris stepped forward. "This incident is going to be reviewed internally by both the Bureau and the Department of Justice. Your conduct tonight will not be swept under the rug. If this had been anyone else, things could have ended very differently, and not in a good way." James sat in the station's hallway, finally free from the interrogation room, watching the clock tick by. Chris had assured him that his role in the undercover operation would be protected, but the events of the night still gnawed at him. The truth was, even with the badge and the title, he wasn't immune. He had been lucky that night, but how many others weren't? He thought of the names, the stories, the faces of those who never made it home because they weren't FBI agents. As Chris walked back to him, James stood. "You okay, man?" Chris asked, his tone softer now, concerned. "Yeah," James replied with a small, forced smile. "I just can't help but think about how close things came tonight. If it had gone differently, I might not be here." Chris nodded, understanding. "I know, but you're here, and what happened will make waves." James sighed. "Waves aren't enough, Chris. We need change. This can't keep happening." Chris looked him in the eye, his expression serious. "We'll do everything we can to make sure this doesn't get buried. You have my word," he concluded. Word of the incident spread quickly. Within days, news outlets were running headlines about the arrest of an FBI agent by a racist police officer. The footage captured by bystanders went viral, igniting debates on social media. Some sided with the police, defending their actions as necessary precaution, while others saw it for what it was, an abuse of power. James found himself at the center of a storm he didn't ask for. Reporters called for interviews, advocacy groups reached out, and the department was scrambling to contain the damage. The footage had been damning, showing Matt's aggression, the lack of probable cause, and the moment the truth was revealed. For James, the attention was overwhelming. He had always kept a low profile, working behind the scenes to get things done. Now, he was being pulled into the spotlight, and it wasn't something he wanted. Still, he knew that his case could spark real conversations about police reform, racial profiling, and the need for systemic change. The investigation into the arrest was swift. Matt faced disciplinary action, and his suspension turned into a termination. The police department publicly apologized, and the chief issued a statement about their commitment to rooting out officers who abused their power. For James, it was a bittersweet victory. He hadn't sought to ruin anyone's career, but accountability had to start somewhere. He hoped that Matt would learn from his mistakes, that other officers would think twice before acting out of prejudice. As the media storm began to die down, James returned to his work with the Bureau, though things felt different now. He was more vigilant, more aware of the world around him. He knew his case was just one of many, and that the fight for justice was far from over.